Alright, for today's critical thought, this is going to be an interesting one. I just had my first, game design consulting meeting, and we got into a really good conversation about the challenge of narrowing or focusing your core gameplay. And it gave me some really good food for thought for today's video. As we've talked about many times over, one of the most challenging aspects of taking a game from your idea and making it for real is being able to figure out what your core gameplay loop is. And this becomes all the more complicated if you're trying to do something like combine multiple genres or game systems. Stop me if you've heard of this one before, where someone will say, my idea is I want to make a procedurally generated first-person shooter with full crafting elements and a roguelike world with driving and player housing, and we'll have dating and visual novel elements as well. You know, the ever-popular, I'm just going to put everything I can think of into a game idea, and it will somehow turn into a multi-million-dollar bestseller. And one of the biggest challenges when it comes to doing this is, once again, having to figure out what your core gameplay loop is. And this becomes even more interesting if we're talking about games built on multi-system design, as in taking different game systems or different genres and kind of packing them together into one unique game. And we have certainly seen the results of that over the last decade. There are so many indie games released, and many of which I've loved, that could be described by saying it's X crossed with Y. And when that works and it's done well, it can create games and designs that you never thought were possible. But there is a huge difference between a well-oiled machine and some kind of stitched together abomination of a design. And we have seen games that seem to go all over the place with their mechanics, and it leaves you with a game that it feels less than the sum of its parts. And trying to figure out what is your prime focus can be very difficult, and why I want to make today's critical thought. As I said a few minutes ago, multi-system design is, in some sense, it is the antithesis of this, because there really isn't a core gameplay loop. There are core systems, yes, but if I were to ask you what your primary focus is in a game like XCOM, or your primary focus in Star Control 2, it's a lot harder. You can say that you're fighting aliens, or you're exploring the galaxy, but that's not a core system. That's the combination of all these elements, and that's the key point for today. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you have just one gameplay system or you've built 15 or 20. How do all these things work with your core gameplay? Because the more systems you add to your game, and this is especially true of 4X or grand strategy games, the more that's added on, the easier it becomes to kind of hide or obscure your core gameplay loop. And when that happens, it can make your game become very hard to play and very hard to understand. Imagine, for instance, if I have a game where in one system it is a first-person shooter, but then over here it's a tower defense game. Over here we have crafting elements. Down here we have slots, and then we have a dart mini game there, and a platformer over here. And while that may certainly add up to a unique game, at the end of the day, the question remains, what is the primary focus of your title? What am I, as the player, going to be doing from beginning to middle to end? Because one of the most important parts about game design is that everything has to work at the end of the day. One of the easiest ways to mess up on a game is to say, I have 3 different game systems, but I'm only going to do one for the first core of the game, and then we never see it or its reference again. That's not good design, because you're basically building an entire game system that you're not really going to be using from beginning to end. And a term that we've talked about, and I know that I've tried to coin over the years, is harmonizing game design. And what that means is every element of your game should be working towards this cohesive whole, or in other words, the core gameplay loop. If I'm building a 2D platformer, every system and every element of my game should be applying to that platforming. If I throw in a cooking minigame or a dating minigame, what points do those serve with the platforming? Do they serve a point with the platforming? If the answer is no, then they're simply ancillary, and they're going to get in the way of the core gameplay loop. And more importantly, if you make those systems required to play, it's going to annoy people who are expecting this game system, but you're forcing them to play this. And this takes me back to the discussion over games like Star Control 2 and XCOM. Both those games are essentially built around 3 or more different game systems. But how they worked and the subtle genius of their designs is that everything feeds into one another. When I play XCOM, my base building gives me better parts for my ships, which helps on the geoscape level. The geoscape level helps me shoot down alien crafts, which sets up stages for the tactical layer. I go fight in the tactical layer and get parts and resources, which lets me upgrade my base back at the base layer. And we just keep going around and around. This goes back to what we talked about with the Holy Trinity core gameplay loop of ARPGs. I fight monsters to get loot, to grow more powerful, to fight monsters to get more loot, and again and again. And the reason why that works so well is that, again, everything is fitting together. I know that whatever I'm doing in your game, whether I'm playing in one part of your game or another, it all feeds into this core gameplay loop. It's the same with XCOM as it is with Diablo, as it is with any of the best games. As long as the player feels like they are making progress, be it in miles or inches, they will keep playing your game and they'll feel motivated to keep going. But if you're throwing 50, 100 different ideas or concepts at the player, but only one thing is actually moving things forward, it's just going to bloat out your game. And more importantly, for every game system you're trying to integrate in your title, that adds time and money to the development process. And as we have seen, I'm sure we all have horror stories of watching this unfold, of what happens when a developer doesn't nail down their core gameplay loop. And you see the game constantly being changed and adjusted. Now, if we're talking about, pre-alpha or coming up with a prototype, that's to be expected. But if we're 30, 50, or heaven forbid, like 80% on the game, and the developer decides, you know what, I want to add racing to my game now, or we're going to move everything over to a brand new engine, then the writing is on the wall. Because at the end of the day, as we've said, game design is very much an art and a science. And while a lot of people focus on the art side, there are things you can do to mitigate those risks. And one of the most important ways is to settle on your core gameplay loop. Whether you want to build the next Fallout or Skyrim or Super Meat Boy, the quicker you figure out what your game is going to be, ultimately the easier it's going to make your development, and more importantly, it's going to allow the rest of the decisions to happen a lot more easily. Because if I know what my core gameplay loop is, then everything that I'm going to think about and build from that point on has to reference that feedback loop. Because if it doesn't, then it's not important to that game. And again, what your core gameplay loop is, that is for you to decide. That is what you need to figure out for your game. And again, the quicker you do it, ultimately the better your game is going to be for it. No one wants to hear, like when the game is 2 months out, someone saying, hey, let's add multiplayer now. Or a week before saying, let's add multiplayer. And as we all know, multiplayer only takes 1 week to work. Unless you're a lazy developer, right? But with that said, we're going to wrap up today's critical thought here. So again, to summarize, understanding what your core gameplay loop is will ultimately help you when it comes to processing and developing your game. And at the end of the day, all your game systems should feed into each other. And more importantly, become greater than the sum of their parts. Because if you're spending a quarter of your game's budget on a system that's only going to be used for like 2 hours of play, what was the point of doing that to begin with? And if that means, unfortunately, either refocusing your idea or throwing out concepts or systems, again, the earlier in development you do that, ultimately will make your game better. But with that said, thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back for daily discussions on design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And if you'd like to suggest a topic for me to look at in the future, please get in touch. But otherwise, thanks again, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/gwbeiser. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.